Not all heroes wear capes. Some wear aprons. And I can think of no greater hero than Ruth Wakefield, inventor of the chocolate chip cookie. So today I'm going to be baking Ruth's original recipe from 1938, as well as her recipe for making cookies during World War II rationing. Then I can do a side-by-side tasting at the end. Chocolate chip cookies, this time on Tasting History. So there are lots of stories, mostly myths, about the invention of the chocolate chip cookie, but they all agree that it took place at the Toll House Inn in Whitman, Massachusetts in or just before 1938. 1938 is definitely when Ruth Wakefield, who ran the inn, printed the first recipe in her cookbook, Ruth Wakefield's Toll House Tried and True Recipes. Though she actually called them chocolate crunch cookies, which makes me think that they're going to be crispier than some of the chewy chocolate chip cookies that you can find today. So the recipe says, cream 1 cup butter, add 3/4 cup brown sugar, 3/4 cup granulated sugar, and 2 eggs beaten whole. Dissolve 1 teaspoon soda in 1 teaspoon hot water and mix alternately with 2 1/4 cups flour sifted with 1 teaspoon salt. Lastly, add 1 cup chopped nuts and 2 bars, 7 ounce, Nestle's yellow label chocolate, semi-sweet, which has been cut in pieces the size of a pea. Flavor with 1 teaspoon vanilla and drop half teaspoons on a greased cookie sheet. Bake 10 to 12 minutes in 375 degrees Fahrenheit oven, makes 100 cookies. So this recipe is not all that different from what you'll find on the back of a bag of chocolate chips from Nestle Toll House, or as Phoebe says,
Nestle Toulouse.
The major differences are today they don't dissolve the baking soda into water and the nuts are very much optional. Also, you don't have to chop up the chocolate today because now we have chocolate chips which are made expressly for this purpose. In fact, you can't even get Nestle's chocolate bars anymore. I don't think that they sell them, so you gotta use the chips if you want to stick with the type of chocolate that she was using. Lastly, the size of these cookies is quite a bit different because she says this makes 100 cookies. So they're going to be pretty small because the modern recipe, which is about the same amount of dough, only makes between 50 and 60 cookies. So to make this original recipe, start by creaming the butter in a stand mixer until it's nice and smooth, and then add 3/4 cup brown sugar, 3/4 cup granulated sugar, 2 beaten eggs, the baking soda water, and the vanilla. Then add the 2 1/4 cups flour, which has the salt already whisked in. Mix this on the lowest speed until everything is just combined. And finally add the cup of chopped nuts, I'm using walnuts, and the 14 ounces of chocolate chips and mix until everything is just incorporated. Now you can of course do this by hand, but Ruth was using a stand mixer. Hers was a Hobart big stand mixer, but you can also do it by hand. Now the recipe doesn't say anything about chilling the dough, but in interviews, Ruth was very explicit in saying that the dough should be chilled overnight, so I'm going to follow her lead and do that. Now a few years later, the recipe had to change quite a bit because of the outset of World War II, or rather America entering the war in 1941-42, because rationing kicked in and it was hard to get some of the ingredients, especially the sugar. Yet there was an effort for home bakers to send these cookies by the boxful as care packages to the men on the front. As this ad states, "Dear Mom, the boys will make you an honorary general if you'll just send us more Toll House cookies." So what's a 1940s housewife to do? Well, luckily this ad also provided a recipe for Toll House cookies without sugar. So to make those, you just need to replace a few of the ingredients. You replace the butter with 1 cup of shortening, and replace the sugar with 3/4 cup strained honey and 3/4 cup maple syrup. The rest is pretty much the same. Start by creaming the shortening, honey, and syrup together, then add the 2 beaten eggs and 1 teaspoon of vanilla. Then whisk together 2 1/2 cups of sifted flour, that's a bit more than the other recipe, along with 1 teaspoon of salt and 1 teaspoon of baking soda. By this time, they've totally ditched mixing the soda with water. Gently mix that into the batter and then add the 1 cup of chopped nuts and the 14 ounces of chocolate chips. Again, I'm going to let this dough chill overnight. Now, once they are chilled, the recipe says to drop half teaspoonfuls of dough onto a baking sheet. But a half teaspoon measured out of dough, that's like 2 chocolate chips. It's just absolutely not enough, and it's going to leave you with far more than 100 cookies. So it's best to do this by weight. They're going to be about 14 grams a cookie or so. The other thing is, while the original dough is very easy to measure out and shape into a ball, the one made with the shortening, that's darn near impossible to measure because it's just so soft and sticky. Even after chilling it for 10 hours, it was still just really soft. You can't shape it into a ball, so I just kind of eyeballed it and plopped it on the baking sheet. Now these are going to be crunchy cookies. They're called chocolate crunch cookies after all, so you're going to expect them to spread quite a bit and get very thin, so leave about 2 inches between each cookie. Also, in later interviews, Ruth Wakefield said that she would press the cookies down, so that's what I'm going to do. Not sure that it's going to matter, but I'll follow her directions. Again, you really can't do that with the shortening version, so just leave them as is. But both get baked in the oven at 375 degrees Fahrenheit, 190 Celsius. Now both of these recipes say to bake them for 10 to 12 minutes, and ovens were different back then. I have an old oven. There's a reason I don't use it. They're inconsistent. 10 and 12 minutes, that was too long for me. I ended up going with 9 minutes, and even then, they were still very, very dark. 10 minutes, they were burnt. So just keep an eye on them. You're looking for a nice golden brown color, and while you watch your cookies, let me tell you a little bit about the history of the chocolate chip cookie. The year is 1938. Ruth Wakefield and her husband Kenneth have been running the Toll House Inn in Whitman, Massachusetts since 1930. And despite being the Great Depression, business was booming, and the inn was always packed with guests clamoring for Ruth's New England cuisine and delightful desserts. Ruth's menu was no stranger to praise. Restaurant critic Duncan Hines himself said that her Indian pudding was the kind of dessert that makes a fellow wish for hollow legs. Indian pudding being one of the oldest desserts in America, made from cornmeal, molasses, egg, and milk, so it's kind of like bread pudding but made with cornmeal. But even with the inn and restaurant doing so well, Ruth was never one to rest on her laurels, and she was always working on new recipes with her staff to wow her customers. Enter the chocolate crunch cookie. Now there are many myths about how this cookie was created. Some say that she was actually working on a different cookie and ran out of nuts, so she added chocolate instead, though the recipe also calls for nuts, so I don't quite see how that works. Others say that she expected the chocolate to kind of melt through the entire cookie, making it a fully chocolate cookie. But since she was a trained home economics teacher and had been baking for years, she would have known that that was not going to happen, so that's a silly story. Perhaps the silliest is that the Hobart machine, the stand mixer, was shaking so much that it happened to knock some chopped chocolate off of a shelf into the dough, and she just kept going. It's kind of silly. No, the story is much more mundane than that. It was just that after a trip to Europe, she and her head pastry chef, Sue Brides, decided to come up with a new cookie. But it wasn't until 40 years later that she finally put these myths to rest, and she kind of leaned into some of the mythology of the cookie and of the Toll House itself. In her cookbook, she says, "In August of 1930, Mr. Wakefield and I bought a lovely old Cape Cod house built in 1709 on the outskirts of Whitman, Massachusetts. At one time, it was used as a toll house where passengers ate, changed horses, and paid toll." Nope, that is not true. In fact, it wasn't built until like 1817 and had never been used as a toll house, but it made for a good story. It kind of held on to that colonial history, and they had already painted 1709 on the sign. What was true is that almost immediately after their creation, Toll House chocolate crunch cookies were a local hit. And she didn't try to keep the recipe to herself. She would actually hand out hand-typed cards with the recipe on it to different guests. And one of the first people to receive this card was a woman named Marjorie Husted, a name you might recall from the episode on Betty Crocker, because Marjorie Husted, at that time, for all intents and purposes, was Betty Crocker. And so shortly after coming up with the cookie, it was featured on the immensely popular Betty Crocker radio show. I can remember we hooked up a little radio in the kitchen and stood around listening to Betty Crocker tell about the Toll House and about the recipe for cookies. But what really made the cookie take off was the fact that the recipe was being reprinted in all these newspapers in New England. And in February of 1939, the Boston Globe reprinted it with one minor change. Instead of calling it a chocolate crunch cookie, they called it a chocolate chip cookie. Now, Ruth's recipe specifically calls for Nestle's chocolate, which at the time was sold in bars. But it turns out she actually wanted to use Baker's chocolate, which was produced not very far away in Massachusetts. But at the time of making the cookie, her wholesaler was out of Baker's chocolate, so she used Nestle's instead, and that turned out to be really fortunate for Nestle, because in 1939, they saw a 500% bump in sales of their semi-sweet chocolate in New England. And so they came knocking on Ruth's door looking to get her official endorsement. And Ruth says that there were several chocolate companies that came a-courtin', but since she had already written the recipe using Nestle's, that's the one that she chose. And on March 20th, 1939, she gave the company the right to use her recipe and the Toll House name. And for this exchange, what did she get paid? I signed off for $1. Of course, you never see the dollar. Though it said she did receive free chocolate for life, still probably not a great business deal for old Ruth, but how was she to know? Now, as soon as Ruth had given the sign-off, Nestle began printing her recipe on the back of every semi-sweet chocolate bar, and soon they realized that the only reason people were buying this chocolate was to make it into the cookies, so instead of having to chop it up, they scored the chocolate bar into 160 tiny little pieces, and then in December of 1940, they figured, well, let's just break them up in the factory, and they introduced the teardrop-shaped chocolate morsel. What with all of American manhood from 6 to 60 clamoring for cookies with small bits of their favorite flavor, chocolate, flecking them throughout, this simple device is a boon to the hurried homemaker. No more sitting around having to break up chocolate into tiny little pieces, because the chocolate morsel, or chocolate chip, was here to stay. But in World War II, even the company sometimes had trouble getting a hold of sugar, so they'd had to make some alterations to the chocolate chips, which made them very, very hard to eat. One executive even admitted that people had complained of chipping their teeth on the chocolate chips. But regardless, chocolate chip cookies became one of the most popular baked goods to be baked at home and then sent in care packages to the front. Now that Nestle's semi-sweet chocolate is harder to get, because so much of it is going to the fighting forces in emergency and combat rations, put it to the best possible use. Make a batch of these golden brown, crunchy Toll House cookies and send them to that soldier boy of yours. As it said, much of the chocolate that America was producing at the time was already being sent overseas in the form of the D ration. Though much of these chocolate bars were of a lower quality and tough to chew, so a home-baked chocolate chip cookie, even if it was a few weeks old by the time it got to you, was definitely preferred. This is probably why they became so popular, because as people started coming back from World War II, they associated good feelings with this chocolate chip cookie. This led to multiple companies putting out their own version of chocolate chips, and in the 1950s, Nestle introduced a Toll House cookie mix. This was followed by them and Pillsbury making a completely pre-made cookie dough served in a tube, which is still the best way to eat it. Like, don't even bake it, just straight out of the tube. Other companies began selling already baked chocolate chip cookies, most famously the 1963 introduction of Chips Ahoy. Now, while chocolate chip cookies have become one of America's most beloved creations, sadly, the location of its creation is no more. Ruth Wakefield and her husband sold the Toll House in the 1960s, but in 1984 it burned down, and today it's a Wendy's. But the Toll House legacy lives on in Massachusetts, and in 1997 the state legislature decided to name a state cookie, an official state cookie, and of course the chocolate chip cookie was going to get it, except that the governor, William Weld, was a fan of the Fig Newton, which was also invented in Massachusetts. But a state representative and former employee of the Toll House decided that she was going to start a campaign for the Toll House cookie being the official state cookie. And she was smart and got all the kids of the state on board. So they came up with wonderful slogans like, "When was the last time your mother baked you a warm batch of Fig Newtons?" And "Fig Newtons are a form of self-punishment." Well, after the results of a phone poll showed that the Toll House cookie was clearly the winner, William Weld decided to relent and name the Toll House chocolate chip cookie the state cookie, and the Fig Newton got the title of state fruit cookie.
A cookie is just a cookie, but Newtons are fruit and cake.
And the kids were not wrong. You don't really bake Fig Newtons at home, and you definitely do bake chocolate chip cookies at home, as I am, and the smell is wonderful. So I think it's about time to take them out the oven. So once they've baked, take them out of the oven and let them cool on a sheet for 5 minutes, then transfer them to a cooling rack and let them cool until room temperature. And here we are, the original chocolate chip cookie and their World War II ration-friendly counterpart. So they're definitely smaller than most that you would find today. I guess it's about the size of a Chips Ahoy, but it's also a lot darker. And I think that is not due to time in the oven as much as due to just the brown sugar versus white sugar ratio. But they smell really good, and lots of big chocolate chunks, and lots of nuts as well. Let's give it a go. Crunchy. I mean, it's a chocolate chip cookie. What's not to like? I wouldn't know that this was any different than the modern version. You know, I mean, it's all the regular ingredients. Not a lot has changed. So maybe it's time to try out the World War II version here, which is considerably more spread out because the dough was just so liquidy. But it's also made it so all the chocolate pieces, you can tell better here, are kind of in the center, and they're all like that. The chocolate chips haven't spread as much. Let's give it a try. So they're softer. They're good. They just aren't nearly as sweet. But there's like an extra flavor in there. That has to be from the maple syrup. It kind of reminds me of the flavor of like Raisin Bran a little bit, but with chocolate. They're actually quite good. And the texture it's not as crunchy, but it's really light. They're like almost pillowy. Which would I choose? I'm gonna go with the original, I think. It's just a little sweeter. But this, not as bad as I was expecting. I'm surprised, pleasantly so. So now we call these cookies here in the US, but in the UK they might refer to them as biscuits. And a little while ago, I filmed an episode with the boys over at Sorted Food where I tried several different British biscuits and talked about their history, so I will put a link to that video in the description, and I will see you next time on Tasting History.